Greetings, everybody. I'll get started pretty much straight away, actually, because we've got an excellent hour ahead of us and we really want to make the most of this time. So I'll say hello to everybody and welcome to, it's the third Material Histories seminar, actually, for 2024 that we're about to embark on now. And we're going to be turning our attention this time, as you know, to objects of time. So I'm Melissa Balanta from the Australian Catholic University. I'll be the chair for today. I'm delighted that you're able to join us. So I'll just begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from unceded land of the Gadigal and Wongal peoples of the Eora Nation. I'm here in Sydney, actually. And I thank them for their care of culture and country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge any First Nations people who might be joining us from elsewhere today. So Material Histories is this seminar series that's offered as a collaboration through the Old Treasury Building, Deakin University and the Australian Catholic University. And in each of the discussions that we've had in this seminar series, we've been exploring a different aspect of material history through an object or a series of objects. They're open, these seminars, to anyone who's just generally interested in material history. And we're hoping to cast, the aim is to cast the idea of thinking about material histories very widely in terms of time and place and the sorts of material objects that we consider each time. So what I'll do now is turn to our two speakers. We're going to hear from Matthew Champion first and then Graham Davison second. And we'll hear from them both one after the other and then have questions sort of collectively at the end of the session. So I will turn firstly to our speaker, Matthew, to introduce you. He is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Melbourne. He's published widely in the history of premodern temporalities and materiality, including his 2017 Chicago book, The Fullness of Time, Temporalities of the 15th-Century Low Countries, which was winner of the 2019 Gladstone Prize from the Royal Historical Society. Matthew's articles have appeared in Past and Present, Speculum, Transactions of the Royal Historical Society, and many other places. He's a co-curator of the current exhibition, Albrecht Dürer's Material Renaissance, in the Arts West Gallery, I think, Matthew, University of Melbourne. So I'll turn over to Matthew now. He's going to be talking to us about turning over material histories of the sandglass. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking from Melbourne today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and acknowledge elders past and present. It's a really great pleasure to be here today and to speak on a topic that really interests me. My paper today forms part of a wider interest in the history of temporalities, on histories of objects, perceptions and experiences of time. And recently what I've been doing is seeking out that history through a history of sound. You can see some of the fruits on the website of the wider project on sounds of time here. But alongside my work on sound, of course, I've been thinking about sound in relationship to silence, the silences of time. And particularly I've been thinking about that through the history of the sandglass. These are fascinating objects which are rarely studied. In fact, quite surprisingly, there's no book on the origins of the sandglass and its early history. So I'm trying to write one, and this paper is part of that work. What I'm hoping to do is to explore the sandglass as a prosaic object of task-oriented time. Here you see a kind of rather simple 16th century sandglass being used in an instrument maker's workshop in Nuremberg in the mid-16th century. I'm interested in it as a pedagogical instrument. Here you see a kind of slightly scary flying sandglass here in a Jewish classroom of the 14th century. I'm interested in thinking about the sandglass as a fashion accessory. So here you have a little sandglass here on the leg of Matthias Schwarz from his Trachtenbuch from the 16th century again. And also very complex uses of the sandglass as a way of negotiating the relationship between time and eternity. Show you here an early Nuremberg altarpiece here with Augustine looking up at the Trinity, but with a sandglass here, which interestingly is topped by a mirror. One is, as it were, looking through a glass darkly here, a little mirror darkly with sandglass as the sign of temporal existence. So one of the chief prompts I had towards considering the material history of the sandglass was being asked by my really wonderful colleague at Melbourne, Jenny Spinks, if I would consider joining a team examining the material world of Albrecht Dürer in late 15th and 16th century Nuremberg, and specifically to examine the time measurement devices encountered in his works, situating them in relation to their use and production. And that, of course, meant sandglasses. Here are some of the sandglasses in Dürer's most famous works, here in St. Jerome's study on the back wall. Here held by Death in the famous Night, Death and the Devil, and of course most famously in Melancholia 1. Now, this wider project has resulted in the very exciting exhibition that Melissa kindly mentioned in her introduction, but I'm going to do another plug for it, currently open in the University of Melbourne's Arts West Gallery. This exhibition is a rare chance to see 90 or so late 15th and early 16th century images, books and objects from the collections of the University of Melbourne and the State Library, and to consider the ways that thinking about materiality can enrich our understandings of this period of critical change and cultural production. So I hope if you have the opportunity to come in, because many of the objects out on display are very rarely seen and extremely interesting. Now, I'm going to return to Dürer briefly later in the paper, but I'm going to start somewhere else today with a remarkable physical sandglass from the collections of the British Museum. When I first spent time with this object in the horology room of the museum, it immediately prompted a question that has opened up a series of material possibilities for understanding these complex, multifaceted objects. This sandglass, as you can see up here, is smashed. And it allows us then to get at the sand inside. So what is the sand? Before I started working on the history of sandglasses, I thought the answer was quite simple. I thought it was sand. I sort of just thought it came from a beach or something like that. But the answer very quickly becomes much more complicated. For example, the late 14th century household book, Le Ménagier de Paris, includes, in the midst of its extensive sets of recipes, one for sand to put in clocks. Take the dust that falls when great tombs are sawed from black marble. Then boil it well in wine like a piece of meat and skim it. Then set it out to dry in the sun. After you reboil, skim and dry 9 times, it will be ready. Now, the recipe is at one and the same time simple and quite surprising. Note the crucial ingredient here, the dust produced by the production of great tombs cut from black marble. This is Tournai stone, probably. So in the first known example of the contents of a sandglass, we have an immediate link to its most classic interpretation as an object, as a reminder of death, a memento mori. Popped up a couple remarkable 16th century examples of that trope. The sandglass made to this recipe, however, does not simply recall the funerary monuments, it's made from exactly the same materials. Not only that, the materials of these monuments have been chosen to stand as memorials for future generations, and they're themselves being rendered as dust, stone turned to dust. In the recipe then, the process of time is being accelerated and distilled into the glass. Gazing at the glass might be taken as an object lesson that faced with time, one is facing death, the ultimate decay of that which might seem most durable. But turned in another direction, the recipe is also about making an object that's going to endure in time, that's going to be preserved. Boiling in wine is a process that applies to the preservation of food, of course, in 14th century cuisine. And the drying of the processed material in the sun then is also further designed to remove any potentially corrupting materials that might interact with moisture. Now, that's a concern of other recipes for sandglass sand. Let's turn just to one of these, a recipe recently brought to light by Pamela Smith's brilliant Making and Knowing project. It comes from a compendium of craft knowledge from Toulouse in the 1580s. This is a recipe for powder to put in clocks of sand, poudre d'horloge de sable. So it is made very fine and without being subject to rust, and by its weight able to flow, taking 1 pound of lead melt it and skim it and purify it from its filth. Then pour into it 4 ounces of finely pulverized common salt, and take good care that there be neither stones nor earth. And immediately after you've poured it, mix continuously very well with an iron until the lead and salt are well incorporated, and lift it immediately from the fire, stirring continuously. And if it seems too coarse, grind it on marble and pass it through a fine sieve. Then wash it so many times that the water becomes clear, throwing away that little powder which will swim on it, renewing the water so many times that it stays entirely uniform. So this use of lead in recipes for hourglasses is well attested. It appears, for example, in the guild regulations for hourglass makers in Nuremberg, where one of the pieces that needed to be made to enter the guild was in fact a quarter hourglass filled with lead. Other surviving early sandglasses were also filled with lead, although to determine this, we're going to need, more specifically, we're going to need to undertake various materials analysis procedures. And I show just a couple of the likely candidates for lead sandglasses from Basel, from the Historisches Museum. But to return to the Toulouse recipe, this is noteworthy, again, for its emphasis on the repetition in the process and the need to construct a material that doesn't absorb moisture, its utter dryness. The resulting material, which Smith's team reconstructed in their lab, ends up with a fine set of smooth-edged balls of lead, a feature which physicists have also studied as key to the success of sand for sand in sandglasses. So the idea is that if you have crystals with too many edges, they get kind of trapped as they flow, whereas if you have these smoother spherical kinds of materials, they'll flow more smoothly. But the material's dryness, its heaviness, its weight, and its coldness also had powerful cultural resonances in Europe in this period. Lead was a material strongly linked in humoral and astrological theory to the actions of Saturn, the god and the planet associated with time. So lead was thus an appealing material for the sands of the hourglass because of both its affordances and its cultural resonances. And this allows me just a very brief return to Dürer's famous Melancholia 1. This image shows a melancholic figure. Hanging above them is a very elaborate sandglass. Now we can say something more. Now we know what might be actually inside it. We can think about the saturnine illness of melancholia and the frozen heavy weight of leaden time that hangs over the entire image. This lead question may also help us think through the implications of one of the most elaborate sandglasses that survives from the period, probably produced again in Nuremberg in one of the city's numerous metalworking craft workshops, and now in the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. This sandglass is likely filled with lead, but it is as if the heavy weight of this material in here is being clothed with a kind of glorified, enduring body. If I can get theological on you just for a little moment, this body of corruption has put on the materials of incorruption. Based lead is being enshrined in gilt silver. And the likeness of this object precisely to the forms of late medieval reliquaries is not, in this reading, coincidental. Further evidence of this kind of sacred clothing of time comes from the images on either end of this sandglass. One end has a clock face with a hand pointing to the time between 11 and 12, the apocalyptic midnight. And this iconography is derived from a kind of devotional manuscript tradition associating clocks with the coming of the end time. I show you one from a nun's manuscript from Utrecht here. At the other end of the sandglass is a cross with nails, the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Holy Name, alongside the date 1506 and the date of a later repair, 1613, down here probably. Here, as the hourglass is turned back and forth, we see time being protected, but time also running out. Time's leaden grains will eventually fall, while the wider frame, the casing, we might say, of God's eternity is going to endure. Now, you might have noticed, of course, that none of this analysis accounts for the red sand inside the object that I started with from the British Museum. The question of this object's exact contents may well be resolved by some isotopic weight analysis of the material itself, and we have a current grant application in to get some funding to get this analysis done at the Dorothy Garrod Labs for isotopic weight analysis in Cambridge. But before then, what I want to do is to undertake a little bit of speculation. A number of glasses with reddish sand survive. This rather wonderful example, for example, in the Met Museum. Or you might think back to that early example that I gave of a more simple sandglass. Now, on the basis of some significantly later sources from the 18th century, this colour has been linked to red sand found at Weissenbrunn, which is over 20 kilometres to the east of Nuremberg. If so, then the history of this material is bound up with a very deep sediment in the history of time indeed. That is the movement of sand by wind in the late Pleistocene period about 12,000 years ago. This led to the formation of the Franconian dunes. And these dunes, these sand dunes, loess, are one of the material conditions for the flourishing of Nuremberg's glass industry and perhaps for the sand inside the sandglass itself. Okay, to conclude the paper then, I want to turn to a final dimension of the British Museum sandglass that focuses on it as an object to be handled and closely observed. This is a sandglass that exceptionally rarely has paintings on either end of it. I'm showing you one of them here. This is a man seated at a table who looks across an interior space towards a large clock face on the opposite wall. On his table sits a sandglass, and on the other wall here, you see a weight-driven domestic clock. The scene is unmistakably related to a woodcut from an Augsburg German translation and edition of a work by Petrarch called De Remediis Utiusque Fortunis, concerning the cures of both fortunes, which was printed in 1532 in German as Von der Arznei bei der Glück. The woodcut is found at the start of the 15th chapter of the second book of the treatise. That chapter has the title you see here, Von Verlierung der Zeit, concerning the loss of time. Turn the hourglass, turn the sandglass, we have another image. And it turns out that it too is related to this same work, these same woodcuts. The figure is balanced on spheres that clearly represent water and earth, and holding in his outstretched arms balls of air and fire, while the moon, sun, and other heavenly bodies beam out. This image comes from the first book of the work, chapter 3, a chapter called Von glückseliger Gesundheit, concerning blessed health. Now, this is exceptionally complicated, and even more complicated when we think about it on an hourglass. But all I'm going to do, given our time constraints today, is gesture towards a fuller analysis. Let's look just quickly at their context in the book. Petrarch's 14th century work was designed to arm the soul against the passions that are stirred up by both kinds of fortune, both good fortune and ill fortune. So in other words, this is part of Petrarch's Christian Stoicism. To undertake its task of tempering the passions through the exercise of reason, the work takes the form of two sets of dialogues. The dialogues partner a character Vernunft, reason, and Tugend, virtue, with different passions. So book 1 is this Vernunft, Tugend, reason, virtue, chatting with Hoffnung and Freude, so hope and joy. And that addresses the troubles associated with having good fortune. And a summary of the book, you might say, is that if you have good fortune, that's not a good thing because it's going to make you forget that you're going to die. It's a cheerful text. The second book turns to misfortune, and here the dialogue isn't with hope and joy, it's with Furcht und Schmerz, fear and sorrow. Reason is having a chat with these characters. The summary of that book is, don't worry too much if you have bad fortune because you're going to die anyway. So armed with that background, let's turn back to the images on the sandglass. So my first observations relate to this image, the startlingly powerful and energetic figure who strides across the ocean on the spheres of the elements. This figure is clearly an image of good fortune. On the opposite end, we have the illustration for the chapter on the loss of time, talking about the ill fortunes of the world. Here we might consider the image as showing the effects of a figure obsessed by this misfortune of the loss of time to the exclusion of all else. Does the image perhaps prompt a viewer to judge this obsession? Like, get up, simply do something, don't watch the passing of time, actually turn the hourglass that sits in front of you here. So let's imagine the implications for our imagined user of the British Museum sandglass. Turning it is literally turning the wheel of fortune from good to ill and from ill to good. Whatever your fortune is, time is going to pass, the end is going to come, but to what end will your life be directed? Will the gaze of the user be distorted by this glass of time's passing? Will time be lost or seen to be as all there is? Will the unsettled motion of the hourglass spur the imagination to a truer vision of the most ultimate things? Will turning over and over and over and over and over and over the glass be a trigger to the exercise of reason and virtue, of Vernunft and Tugend, a rational soul purged through the repetition of this habit of moderating the passions, as in Petrarch's philosophy? Okay, big questions, but what I'm going to do now is simply to break off. And what I hope is that today's paper has helped to gesture towards an expansive material history of the sandglass, its affordances, its materials, its different forms. As the project is unfolding, it's in fact comparison that's emerging as key here, not simply of objects to other objects or images to objects, but also of parts of objects to other objects. What's the sand inside different objects? Constantly turning over the sandglass in our minds is also a process of seeing how objects, materials, and images flow into each other and diverge from one another. These are histories of possible worlds, we might say, as seen not in a single grain of sand, but in many, many different grains of sand. So on that note, I'll finish and hand over to Graham.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm trying not to feel too anxious about the passing of time or something after I've heard, but yeah, that and just lots to contemplate from that talk. So we'll come back to that at the end of hearing what Graham has got to say now, but thank you so much. So I will now turn everybody to introducing our next speaker, who's Graham Davison, as you can see here. It's my great pleasure to bring Graham, Emeritus Sir John Monash, Distinguished Professor of History at Monash University, before us now. So he's written, as I can imagine, most people here know, very widely on Australian history, on heritage, on public history. His publications include so many books: The Rise and Fall of Marvellous Melbourne, The Unforgiving Minute, How Australia Learned to Tell the Time, The Users and Abusers of Australian History, Car Wars, City Dreamers, Lost Relations. So Graham is a former chair of the Heritage Council of Victoria, an advisor to the National Museum of Australia, and co-editor of A History of the Powerhouse Museum. Graham's presentation today, as you can see, is Punctuality and Progress, Reflections on Clocks, Time and History. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you, Melissa. For over 40 years now, I've been looking at clocks and thinking about the history of time. So in this talk, I'm going to take a very rapid tour of some of the clocks that I've known and reflect on their significance as evidence for historians. I'm not exactly sure when my clock obsession began. My mother once told me that my first words were tick-tock, but my friend Judy Brett says that that's impossible because babies first learn words like mummy rather than T words like tick-tock. But at any rate, perhaps a more likely source of my obsession, was that, like many people in the 1940s, I was reared by a regime invented by the New Zealand childcare expert Dr. Truby King of strict 4-hourly breastfeeding. And it was not until 1946, with the publication of Dr. Spock's Common Sense Book of Baby Care and Child Care, that we children and mothers were delivered from this clock-based regime. At any rate, whether or not I was born with or quickly induced into a consciousness of clocks and time, I began to think much more critically about the history of time and time-telling in the 1980s, when I joined other Australian historians in a large collaborative project to mark the bicentenary of British settlement in Australia in 1988. Rather than a conventional narrative history with its built-in teleological assumptions about where history was heading, our leader, Ken Inglis, invited us to take a series of slices through Australian history at the anniversary years 1788, 1838, 1888, and 1938. And as co-editor of the volume centred on the year 1888, I deliberately tried to stop thinking about that year as a narrative historian might, as a milestone towards, say, the path towards federation, but to think of it much more as contemporaries did, without knowledge of where they were heading. So I read the personal diaries of farmers and miners and factory workers and suburban commuters, alert for signs of how they measured and noted time, for evidence of the rhythms and routines of their lives. 1888, I discovered, was a time when time measurement itself was rapidly changing under the influence of new technologies like the telegraph, the telephone, and especially the cheap pocket watch. The Waterbury watch, which you see an example here, and there are examples you can find also here in Museum Victoria, had rapidly decreased the cost of a pocket watch. A pocket watch had previously cost something like £3 or £4, as much as a man might earn in a week. And the Waterbury watch brought it down to about 10 and sixpence, as much as a man might earn in a day. And with that revolution in time came a transformation of people's consciousness of time and time consciousness, and synchronization of their activity in new ways. After the book was published, I continued my inquiries into the history of time-telling in Australia, pushing my research back into the early colonial period and forwards into our own time. Some of the most telling evidence that I found was, of course, outside libraries and archives, in the horological collections of museums like this one, and in the human landscape itself. Our children were then in their early teens and began to complain of their father's habit of making unscheduled stops by the roadside to take photographs of time ball towers, church clocks, bells, and factory whistles. These are some of the pictures that I took around that time. Some museum objects, landscapes, aphorisms, folk tales, songs, anything can be evidence for the historian, especially for the historian of time. Sometimes the evidence is there, hiding in plain sight, but unrecognised for what it was. I wonder how many of the thousands of people who each day pass through Southern Cross Station recognise the old clock tower, parked like a postmodern sculpture at the entrance, as the timepiece that once hurried homebound commuters down Elizabeth Street toward Flinders Street Station. In 1994, I published a book, The Unforgiving Minute, subtitled How Australians Learn to Tell the Time, a short book on a very big topic. European Australia, I contended, was uniquely a product of modern time-telling, and its history had unfolded not evenly, but through a series of distinct shifts associated with the arrival of new technologies like the pocket watch, the radio, and the communications satellite. It was a ship's chronometer named K1 after its maker Larkham Kendall, which had guided Arthur Phillip and his first fleet to Port Jackson in 1788. When I wrote that book, I'd only seen photographs of K1 and its prototype K4, which was the fourth of the remarkable ship's chronometers made by John Harrison, the working class hero of Dava Sobel's best-selling book, Longitude. Later, I visited the Royal Observatory in Greenwich to see the room where Harrison's clocks are displayed, one of the most exciting museum exhibits in the world, in my opinion. Later still, thanks to my former colleague at Monash, Kevin Fewster, who'd become the director of the National Maritime Museum in London, I was fortunate to see some of these famous clocks up close while they were on the bench being serviced by the observatory's horologists. In most museums, the historians and the technical staff are distinct professions, but at Greenwich, in a tradition that honours scientist craftsmen like John Harrison, the horologists who maintain the clocks are also the scholars who write their history. The unforgiving minute was a product of serendipity as much as systematic research. One day during a holiday in Tasmania, I walked into the Victoria Museum in Launceston, where I found a curious handless clock. It was unlabelled and apparently neglected. It was a watch clock, sometimes called a telltale clock, from Port Arthur, where it was used to monitor the guards who were supposed to be keeping the prisoners under constant surveillance. Every quarter hour, the guard was obliged to hammer a metal peg through the aperture, and if he failed, his inattention would be brought to the attention of the supervisor the next morning. The Port Arthur clock was the prototype of such modern surveillance devices of the factory punch clock. During the 1980s and 90s, through my involvement in the heritage movement, and later as an advisor at the National Museum, I'd become keenly interested in Australia's material culture. And in 2004, I was invited to co-edit and write a new history of Sydney's Powerhouse Museum. One of the museum's most popular exhibits was the Strasbourg clock, a 1/6 side working replica of the famous astronomical clock in Strasbourg Cathedral. First constructed in 1352, the original Strasbourg clock was considered one of the mechanical wonders of the world, a model of the universe which measured not only the hours of the day, but the days of the week, the cycles of the sun and moon, the circulation of the planets, the signs of the zodiac, and the seasons of the Christian year. Once a day at noon, figures of the 12 apostles processed around the proscenium of the clock and bowed towards their Lord. In 2011, I made a special trip from Tübingen, where I was a visitor, to Strasbourg to see this performance, only to find that the cathedral was closed to visitors for a special church service. Sydney's replica of the clock was the work of a native-born working man and self-educated inventor, Richard Smith, who is said to have reconstructed the entire machine with no assistance beyond an illustration in a book. Smith had made the clock as a birthday present to New South Wales on the occasion of the 1888 centenary of British settlement. If I'd known of it when I was doing that book for the bicentenary, of course, it would have merited inclusion. And Smith had actually Australianised his model of the clock with panels honouring the centenary and pictures of local worthies. At a time when patriots feared for the country's youth, Smith's clock was hailed as proof of their technical prowess. His demonstrations of the clock became a regular feature of the museum's program for almost half a century. But was his achievement really as wonderful as it was thought to be? In my chapter in the history of the powerhouse, I showed that models of the Strasbourg clock had actually been exhibited in many other countries. And in fact, an American one had been on tour in Australia in 1886, just a block or so from where Smith had his shop. Sydney's Strasbourg clock, I concluded, was a triumph of imitation rather than a miracle of invention. Clocks, whether they are as complex as Strasbourg's or as simple as the Waterbury watch, exert a powerful hold on our imagination. Until the arrival of the computer, they were probably the most wonderful machines to enter the lives and homes of many people. In his famous book, Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, the English clergyman William Paley likened the perfect contrivance of a clock to the divine ordering of the natural world. When he wrote his book, Paley was Archdeacon of Carlisle Cathedral, where my great-grandfather, Thomas, later became a chorister, and was living in the village of Dalston, close to where Thomas's grandfather, William Davidson, worked as a block printer. I sometimes thought about Paley and his watch when I visited Carlisle in 2018 to research my most recent book, My Grandfather's Clock. I inherited this clock, the book from which the book takes its title, from my great aunt Elizabeth, Sissy as we called her, who willed it to my father with instructions to pass it on to me when he died. My father was born in Birmingham and came to Australia with his parents just before the Great War. Sissy, who you see on the left, who never married, stayed behind to look after her parents until they died. Then at the age of 54, she sailed out to Australia, bringing the clock with her. I'd always supposed that the clock had been given to my great-grandfather Thomas, who you see here, who had been the manager of a tin plate factory, by his workmates when he retired. When I looked at it more closely, I realised that it was much older. In 1929, my Uncle Frank, then in his 20s, returned to England to attend a Boy Scout jamboree. He visited Thomas, then in his 90s, and in the midst of a conversation about the family's history, the clock struck. The old man raised his finger and said, "Listen, our ancestors." But who were the ancestors who apparently spoke so mysteriously through the clock? The face of the clock is inscribed with the name of its maker, Robert Hodgson of Annan, a small port town about 20 miles across the border from Carlisle, Thomas's birthplace. From a local census, I know that in 1801, Thomas's great-grandfather, John Davidson, was living just a few doors from Hodgson, the clockmaker. So it's almost certain that the clock that's now in my living room has been in my family for at least 6 generations. In 1801, Carlisle, a garrison town with a castle and a medieval cathedral, had begun to feel the first tremors of the Industrial Revolution. In a famous article, Time, Work, Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, the historian Edward Thompson argued that the Industrial Revolution brought a radical transformation in people's inward notation of time. The number of clockmakers in Cumberland had more than doubled during the last quarter of the 18th century. Carlisle's clockmakers boasted that the excellence of the town's factories was attributable to the technical proficiency of local clockmakers. If you stand in the town square of Carlisle today, the transition between the pre-industrial and industrial time regimes is symbolized in the juxtaposition of 2 timepieces, the sundial on the old 17th century market cross in the foreground, and the mechanical clock installed on the roof of the town hall by the mayor, John Richardson, in 1801. It was in fact in around this time, in 1801, that my great-grandfather William Davidson crossed the border to Carlisle and began working as a block printer in this factory, which still exists actually and is still producing fine fabric at Cummersdale, just outside Carlisle. Block printers were paid by what they produced, and the clock would have been very useful to William as he monitored his performance. For years I had lectured students on the history of the Industrial Revolution, but viewing it through the history of my own family and its clock gave that story a more human face. Clocks are, of course, important to the history of time, but the machine assumes significance only in relation to the values, including the religious values of those who use it, as Matthew's been illustrating already. Just recently, I gave a talk about my grandfather's clock to a group that included the former Master of Queen's College, Dr. David Runier. Oh, that's the wages book in the factory. Who's formerly the Master of Queen's College at the University of Melbourne. After lunch, David mentioned that his old office houses a clock once owned by the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. Queen's, I should explain, was founded by the Methodist Church as a residential college for young Methodist men, including trainees for the Methodist ministry. Methodism, as the name implies, was a methodical religion, and Wesley's injunction to redeem the time, saving every fleeting moment from sin and Satan, was among the sources that Edward Thompson, who, by the way, was also a son of a Methodist minister, quoted in his famous article. Like Thompson, I was also the son of a Methodist family, so knowledge that Queen's held a clock that belonged to the founder of our religion, and therefore perhaps another author of my time obsession, piqued my curiosity. I discovered that Queen's has quite a collection of Wesleyana, including a bookshelf, spectacles, and an inkstand that apparently belonged to Wesley. Well, so was the Wesley clock really Wesley's, or the Queen's clock really Wesley's? And how did it come to rest so far from home? I've only got a few minutes left to talk about this, but I can tell you I visited Queen's and looked at the clock, which has inscribed with a plaque which tells you part of its story. It belonged to the Reverend John Wesley, so it said, was presented by the trustees of the Orphan House at Newcastle on Tyne to the Reverend F. Neal in the year 1848. This Reverend F. Neal was actually the father of another Francis Neal, who came to Australia in 1862 and who passed the clock on to Queen's. I was able to verify that that the first Francis Neal had indeed been a minister at the Orphan House. He'd spent expensive period of time there, and that it was in 1848 when he was said to have been presented with the clock was just the moment when he left the Orphan House and went to another circuit. So it's very likely that that the clock was indeed associated with the Orphan House. I was moving towards, in fact, verifying the provenance of the clock when I got rather a shock. I was at the Uniting Church Archives researching the life of the son, the second Francis Neal, when the archivist Jenny Bars drew my attention to an article entitled "A John Wesley Relic," which had appeared first of all in the London Daily News and then later in the Brisbane Daily Telegraph. According to this article, John Wesley's clock, the one from his study in his orphan house, had not gone to Australia at all, but been presented by the last trustee to the Carville Chapel in Wallsend, a suburb of Newcastle. Did this clock still exist, I wondered? Last week, I emailed the clock. I emailed the church in Newcastle, and sure enough, here is a photograph of the clock which now resides in the Wesley Room at Brunswick Place. So which clock is Wesley's and which is the imposter? The Carville Chapel clock is stylistically older and similar to the only other clock known to have been Wesley's, which he presented to the First Methodist Church in North America in the John Street Church in New York. A clock located only a few miles from the site of the Orphan House seems a more plausible claimant to Wesley's legacy than one in the corner of an office 12,000 miles away. But there's confusion about its provenance too, and about how the Carville Chapel clock was acquired, and it is, after all, much larger, with an 18-inch dial and a sonorous bell that seems more appropriate for a classroom or a church than the tiny study that Wesley was supposed to have inhabited. There's still some paths to follow and pages to turn before I exhaust my interest in Wesley's clock. It's possible that both clocks belonged in some way to the Orphan House, a mansion with many rooms, but just as possible that neither was actually Wesley's. As you can see, my interest in clocks as historical artifacts is not yet exhausted. Sometimes when I wind my grandfather's clock and stop to listen as it chimes the hour, I imagine the generations of my family who performed that ritual before me. I visualize the daily routines they followed in the households where it stood in 3 countries over 2.5 centuries since it was made. With its face, hands, and ticking heart, a clock is amongst the most human-like of machines. It's no wonder that they fascinate us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Graham. Yeah, both of these talks are amazing examples of how object histories are so rich and encompass so many things. You know, you've both given us really amazing examples of that, quite apart from anything else just now. I guess what I just wanted to ask initially, I was just thinking, because what really struck me, Graham, is when you mentioned just like how profoundly it transformed people's experiences to be able to afford and have a pocket watch, you know, and suddenly have one on, sorry, wristwatch, or, you know, have your own one. It seems of how significant that was. And so maybe this is a silly question, Matthew, but just, you know, obviously the sandglasses that you're talking to us about are incredible, contemplative, gorgeous objects. Are there humble or humdrum sandglasses? How widely would they have been distributed? You know, so can you give us just a little bit, I guess, of that wider sense of how widely they were distributed in the periods that you've been thinking about?
It's a fabulous question, and it really involves work with inventories from the period where, you know, sometimes these objects are so simple that they're not mentioned, you know, so we have the absence of the inventory. Usually you get the more elite objects are the things which are recorded. I mean, the distribution must be relatively wide given the number of surviving objects and the range of surviving objects, which range from very simple sort of carved wooden objects, some very small metal cylinders that become quite widely distributed in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, I mean, my argument in relation to the sandglass is you know, does have a sort of sideways slant to the history of horology here, which is that the history of horology is usually told as the history of mechanical wall clocks through to chronometers and into the Industrial Revolution. The sandglass is a technology that doesn't go anywhere. I mean, there are little refinements you can make, but it just works to do its job. And to my mind, it gives us a slightly different window into that task-oriented time that E.P. Thompson talks about, in that, you know, we're not necessarily talking about synchronizing hours with the use of these objects. We're talking about how do you time precise activities. So, you know, records from guilds, for example, the length of time you're allowed to speak at a guild meeting, churches for timing sermons, kitchens for timing processes for recipes and so on. Also the use in prayer regimes, you know, to kind of come back to the question of Methodism and its longer connections back into the world of the timed devotions of the Devotio Moderna of the 15th century, with whom there's a dialogue across the centuries there. So I suppose what I'm trying to do with thinking about the distribution of these objects is to, in a way, decenter the mechanical clock and to refocus on these other varieties of time that are not as much writable into a history of absolute synchronization of the style that Graham's done so elegantly today. Not questioning the method, Graham, but, you know, trying to find some of the other kinds of time that we're able to approach.
Yes, yeah, thank you. So in terms of Graham, for either of the two of you, actually, I'll put a question to you before I throw it back to the two of you reflecting, so that there's a question here from Margaret, actually. She's thanking you for your presentations. And I think this is directed to both of you, actually. Can you each suggest when it was that ordinary people believed they needed to own a timepiece in order to order their lives? So Matthew's partly answered this question, Graham. It's referred to the pocket watch, but do you have some more kind of observations or to make on that?
Perhaps I'll venture a little. As I explained, I first became interested in how people's notation of time was reflected in documents like diaries and journals. And I then began to look for evidence of the spread of the pocket watch. I mean, we know from museums that they were common. We know that we know what their price was. One of the other interesting pieces of evidence, if you look at late 19th century photographs of working men, I'm thinking of trade unionists among other people, you'll see groups of people and they're all wearing their pocket watch, or appear to be doing, because there's a chain across their waistcoat. I'm told that just as in the 1950s, it was said that some people who couldn't actually afford a television set put up an antenna. So in the late 19th century, there were men who had chains across their waistcoats who didn't actually have a pocket watch at the end of it. But nonetheless, it was a kind of a badge of respectability to wear a pocket watch. And that became the case. Of course, the pocket watch remains the norm until the Great War. And then it's the Great War that accelerates the introduction of the wristwatch, because a soldier could more easily perform his duties if he didn't, and of course, synchronization was at the heart of modern warfare. You could more readily perform your duties if you didn't have to fumble with the watch, and if you had it on your wrist.
Yeah, I realized there was a slippage even as I was talking of like confusing the pocket and the wristwatch, actually, when I was just, you know, because that's so much the association now too, that yeah. So are there reflections that either of you would like to give, I guess, on thinking about relationships between your papers, or just the other things that you thought about as each other was speaking?
Well, can I just, one thing I failed to draw attention to, Matthew, you mentioned that when people in early modern times, and perhaps even in modern times, thinking about time, they're thinking both about sacred time and secular time, if you like. Wesley, in his own thinking, he is both a person who is convinced that the end is coming. So kairos, the sense of sacred time, is very present in his mind, and he's also equally impressed with sacred with secular time. In that example of his clock that it's in New York, you'll notice that it's inscribed with a text from Matthew, which is talking about being prepared for the end time. So these ideas are very much present in Wesley's mind, even though he's now often thought of as heralding that calculative modern notion of time.
I mean, on that point, I always think it's just useful to say that there's absolutely no relationship between precision and secularization. And that long old hoary chestnut of the scholarship that people like Le Goff and Bilfinger and so on bring into the historiography, I think is exceptionally unhelpful. The first people most interested in precision are precisely the most religious people. Yeah. In the history of clockmaking and horology. Yeah. And it's about these regularizations of routines and rhythm, and technological innovation is being driven out of religious culture here. So the old story of science and religion that we've left behind, we still have to keep leaving behind, because people keep reactivating that story in relation to the history of time. So I'm quite zealous on this point. Because all this kind of drive towards technological change in the 14th and 15th centuries, which comes to a very much wider public in the 16th century with the invention of the pocket watch, and then the dissemination also through mass production of sandglasses, and also critically the mass production of handheld sundials, really alters the way that we think. We have to have sort of an ecology of timekeeping that helps us to think about, measures of time that we think of as kind of imprecise, but actually do quite precise work in the cultures where they're activated. So that's a sort of bigger question. I mean, the other thing which I was totally delighted by, Graham, in your paper, was this emphasis on the sounds of these objects.
Yeah.
This wonderful claim that you hear the ancestors in the bell.
Yeah.
This is, the perfect example of how these objects are doing far more work than just precisely timing the hour for people. And it's interesting that it's the bell that does that, of course, because the bell, I do think there's a genuine change in the way that the bell is perceived across the 18th and 19th centuries, which makes it an object really tied to the sounds of a past rather than the sounds of the present. So you hear bells and you're transported back in time. I think that is a shift from, the notion of what a bell does in the 14th and 15th centuries, and that shift that, Alain Corbin analyzes too in the famous book on village bells, is a really important part of now how in modernity we do treat the sounds of time as a kind of nostalgic object, but one that has some greater immediacy of access to the past than other forms of communication. There's a directness to the bell. So I thought that was just a wonderful observation and fascinating.
Yeah. So I've just got a question now, Matthew, is how accurate were the early sandglasses in measuring passing of time? And is it influenced by, I don't know, the properties of the sand or, yeah.
That's a great question. In that little Trachten book I showed you with the neat little leg sand glass, that says that it measured 8 minutes. I have no particular reason to doubt the precision of that. We've done a little bit of turning. The curator in Nuremberg very kindly has turned the sandglasses a couple times, and we time them. They do vary a bit in their length, but they sit around the same lengths of time as you turn them. they have the issue that any sandglass has, you know, in any games cupboard that you've got, that they sometimes stop. So there's that does mean that you have to focus on them if you're actually interested in their functioning. You have to have a particular intensity of engagement that you might not with objects that you set running and they just run okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess that also that sense of if the key point of them is for a particular activity, it doesn't matter so much for that, you know, it's what we
where that becomes more troubling is in navigation, because before the chronometer, it was the sandglass that was one of the principal instruments for timing navigation processes on board ships. And there you do get, you know, significant worries about, say, people who turn the sandglass too early. It's called eating the sand. And that can lead to very dangerous situations. So, you know, the question of precision is a sort of how precise question.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's really fascinating. I don't know whether we even have time, because I was thinking about, oh my goodness, the mass production of sundials and other, I don't know whether you can quickly tell us about that actually before I feel we sort of wrap it up. When did that happen? Or, you know, that's...
Yeah, so the early 16th century, the sundial industry really gets going out of actually Nuremberg again, the ivory sundials of Nuremberg, and they're found in archaeological finds all over Europe. And they're quite interesting because they're often open and close. They open and close objects. So they're sort of portable, and you're supposed to know where you are and be able to measure them according to the different longitude and so on. But they often also have little religious casings too, just to sort of keep the complexities of time in operation. So yeah, the 16th century is a big moment in this transformation of time.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. We've only got a couple of minutes to the hour, so I will wrap that up now. But many thanks for both of you. And yeah, I'm be really looking forward also to reading My Grandfather's Clock now. Graham, having heard you talk.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting, Matthew, that you drew attention to that remark. I mean, if there was a moment when I knew I had a book in that topic, it was when I read that journal entry of my uncle's recording my great-grandfather saying, "Listen, our ancestors," when the clock struck. And it was so resonant and really convinced me that I had a topic.
Yeah. Makes me think my grandfather has died recently, and I really miss his grandfather. You know, the clock. It was a grandfather clock. Beautiful particular sound of that pendulum swinging and things, and you know that knowing I won't hear that again actually always makes me feel emotional. Actually, so. But on that note,
when I inherited the clock, it didn't work, so I got it repaired, and so that it went again. And my objective was to be able to have it when my own grandchildren came, to come and hear it strike and be able to raise my finger and say, "Listen, our ancestors." I thought it was the most peculiar gesture, but I at least had the satisfaction of doing it.
Generational transfer there. Very good. I've got thanks coming in. Thanks, Deb. Deb Tout-Smith is thanking both of you. And so, yeah, I just noticed up here on the screen, as you can see, the next Material History seminar series is on the 1st of November. It's going to be on the topic of watery objects. So stay tuned for some more details. You can check the Material Histories page on the Old Treasury Building website for details. And we'll look forward to seeing you all there, I hope. So thank you.